I used to think family fights were loud. Slamming doors, screaming matches, somebody crying in the driveway. I was wrong. Sometimes it's just one email, one subject line, one sentence that turns your stomach cold. They threatened to sue me over $16,000. Not because they needed it, not because they were desperate, because they wanted to win. And the crazy part is, they didn't even realize what they were really gambling with. They thought the only thing on the table was money. But that threat? It lit the fuse on a secret my dad had buried for decades. And once that secret came up, it didn't just blow up our inheritance. It blew up the whole family. Here's the moment it started. I'm sitting on my couch, shoes still on, work bag on the floor. I open my phone and I see my brother's name, Joe. Half-brother, technically. Same dad, different moms. Joe doesn't do small talk. He's the kind of guy who treats every conversation like a negotiation. So when I see his message, I already know it's going to be something like, "We need to talk," or "Call me now." Instead, it's an email. And he CC'd our other brother, Mac. The subject line is polite, almost professional. Something like a landlord would send before an eviction. Then I read the body. It's not a request. It's an accusation. He says I stole from them. He says I owe them. Not just what I took, but interest. And if I don't pay in 6 months, they'll take me to court. 6 months. Like I'm some stranger who ran off with their wallet. I stare at the screen, waiting for the punchline. Because I'm thinking, we're brothers. We grew up together. You don't sue your brother over a number, unless it was never about the number. I read it again, slower. He's listing damages. He's talking about emotional distress, like he watched a YouTube lawyer once and decided he could freestyle a lawsuit. And the words that hit me hardest aren't even the legal ones. It's the tone. The tone says, "You're not family. You're the enemy." I can feel my heartbeat in my throat. Not because I'm scared of court. I'm not. I'm scared of what this means. Because if Joe is willing to put this in writing, he's already told a story about me. And once somebody tells a story about you long enough, they stop hearing the truth. I call him. Straight to voicemail. I call Mac. Nothing. So I just sit there. Phone in my hand, staring at the ceiling like it's going to answer me. And my mind keeps landing on the same question. Why now? Why would they go nuclear over 16 grand? Then my stomach drops again when I realize they didn't go nuclear today. They've been loading this for a while. Because attached to the email is a document. A contract. Typed up like it came from a lawyer, but you can tell it didn't. It's one of those documents where the font looks too clean, the language looks too confident, and the whole thing smells like somebody trying to scare you into obedience. And buried inside it is the trap. 6 months. Not 2 years, not when you can. 6 months. And for a second I actually laugh. Not because it's funny, because it's insane. Because the money they're fighting about, the money that ruined my life in their story, they wouldn't even have it if I hadn't chosen to share it. That's what makes the threat feel so personal. It's like handing someone your jacket because they're cold, and they turn around and call you a thief because your pockets weren't empty. I look at Joe's name on the screen, and I realize something else. Joe didn't write this alone. This has my dad's fingerprints all over it. Not literally, but spiritually. The timing, the pressure, the handle it quietly energy. My dad has always been the guy who thinks conflict can be managed if you just make the right deal. And Joe? Joe thinks every deal has a winner and a loser. And I guess today, he decided I was the loser. So I did the one thing Joe wasn't expecting. I stopped reacting like a brother, and I started thinking like someone who's about to be framed. Because if your own family can turn you into a villain over money, to understand why 16,000 turned into a threat, You have to understand the money. Because this wasn't paycheck money. This was legacy money. The kind that shows up in paperwork when someone dies and never leaves the family again. My grandparents raised me in that quiet, old-school way. They didn't flex. They didn't drive loud cars to prove anything. They just had stability. The kind of stability that makes people around you act weird. And when my grandparents made decisions, they made them with attorneys. Not the kind you see on billboards. The kind who don't have to advertise. When I was a kid, I didn't know any of that. I just knew my grandparents were the safest place in my life. And then, my grandmother died. Not long after that, my grandfather. And when they passed, they left something behind that wasn't a house or a car or jewelry. They left a fund. It was set up in my name with a simple rule. I couldn't touch it until I turned 21. So for years, it was like this invisible box sitting in the corner of my life. I'd hear it mentioned in whispers at family gatherings. I'd catch my dad watching me when money came up, like he was running a calculation. But nobody explained it to me directly. Not until I was old enough to sign the papers. When I turned 21, I went to meet an estate attorney. He slid a folder across the table like it weighed 100 pounds. Inside was a letter from my grandparents. Not a long letter, just deliberate. They wrote that they wanted things to be fair. That word showed up more than once. Fair. Not equal. Not identical. Fair. And I remember thinking, okay, fair makes sense, because my situation was different from Joe and Mac. We shared a dad, but our lives weren't the same. Joe and Mac were older than me. They had their own moms. They had their own support systems. Me? I didn't. My grandparents were my foundation. So when I opened the account and saw the balance, I just sat there for a second. It was more money than I'd ever had access to. More money than most people my age even know what to do with. And the attorney explained the basics, and I nodded like I understood, even though my brain was just repeating, "This is real. This is real." Because even with all that money sitting there, my first thought wasn't, "Finally, I'm free." My first thought was, what's the right thing? So I called Joe and Mac. I told them the truth. I said, there's a fund. It's in my name. I can access it now. I could hear the silence on the line shift. Not surprise, recognition. Like they'd been waiting for this moment. I told them what my grandparents wrote about being fair. And I said, I want to split this. I want us to all get something. Joe immediately got practical. How much? He asked. Not, are you okay? Not, that's amazing. How much? Mac was quieter. He did the thing where he lets Joe speak first, then adds a little agreement like a stamp. And I made my offer. 100,000 each. 3 ways. Simple. Clean. No fighting. Joe acted like he was doing me a favor by accepting. Like he was generous for not arguing. Mac sounded grateful, and I told myself, good. We can be normal about this. We can be brothers about this. I even built in one extra rule to keep it clean. I said we'd wait until the youngest, Joe, hit 21, so everything could be transferred properly. Then we'd deal with whatever was left, if anything was left. Because I didn't want constant little withdrawals, constant little arguments. I wanted it done, all at once. One clean cut. Joe agreed. Mac agreed. And for a while, it worked. On paper, we were fine. But now, looking back, I can see what I missed. The way Joe asked questions that weren't really questions. The way he wanted updates. The way my dad suddenly started calling more. Not to ask how I was doing, to ask what I planned to do next. And that's where the next mistake started. Because it wasn't Joe who put the idea in my head. It was my father. He called me one night like he was doing me a favor, and he said, "Listen, you're 21. You should do something smart with it." He said smart the way people say safe, the way people say responsible. Then he hit me with the pitch. Buy a house. Not rent, not save, buy. And at first, I felt that little rush of pride, like I was finally stepping into adulthood. Like my grandparents' money wasn't just money, it was a chance. But the way my dad said it, it didn't feel like advice. It felt like a plan he'd been waiting to hand me. And I didn't know it yet, but that plan was the doorway Joe was about to kick open. My dad called it a smart move. That's how he sold it. Not as a risk, not as a temptation, as responsibility. "Rent is throwing money away," he said. "You're 21. You've got a shot people would kill for. Buy a house." I should have heard the hunger underneath that advice, but I didn't. I wanted to believe my dad was finally proud of me. Not just proud that I existed, proud that I could build something. So I listened. We started looking at houses like it was a normal father-son thing. Weekend showings, quiet neighborhoods. My dad pointing at countertops like he was shopping for himself. And we found one. Small, solid, nothing fancy. The kind of place that looked like it could hold peace. It was around $130,000. I thought, okay, mortgage, down payment, done. Then reality hit me in the face. I couldn't get a mortgage. Not because I was irresponsible, because I was young. Thin credit, not enough work history. And my dad, who had been all confidence, suddenly got very calm, like he'd expected this. He said, "No problem. We'll do it another way." He told me we could pay cash. Cash. He said it like it was nothing. And then came the pitch that changed everything. He said, "Use the fund." I hesitated. That money wasn't just money to me. It was my grandparents' last act of protection. A rope they threw me when they weren't here anymore. And my dad goes, soft voice, reasonable tone, "It's your money. You're not stealing. You're investing." Then he added the part that made it feel safe. "Just borrow $30,000 from it. Temporary. I'll help you pay it back. We'll have it back in there before Joe turns 21. Before Joe turns 21, he said it like a deadline, a clean finish line, like nothing could go wrong. I remember standing in that kitchen, paperwork spread out, phone buzzing, my dad waiting for my answer. And I felt that weird mixture of pride and fear. Because buying a house wasn't just a decision, it was proof. Proof that I wasn't going to end up struggling like everyone expected. So I said yes. I wired the money. $30,000. And we bought the house. At first, everything looked fine. I moved in, I painted, I set up a little routine. And I told myself, we'll pay it back. It'll be clean. My dad made payments here and there, not big ones, not consistent ones, but enough to keep me calm. And every time I asked, he'd say the same line, "Relax, we've got time." Then the months started stacking up. Bills don't care about your intentions. Life doesn't care about your deadlines. And I kept telling myself, Joe doesn't even know. Joe doesn't need to know. I'm fixing it. But the truth was, I wasn't fixing it fast enough. Because I wasn't just paying back 30 grand. I was paying back a story. A story that said I was in control. And I wasn't. Time moved the way time always does. Quiet. Brutal. Joe got closer to 21, and as that date approached, the fund stopped being my grandparents' gift in my head. It became a timer. Because the moment Joe hit 21, I had promised him one thing. His 100,000. Clean transfer, no drama. So one night, I sat down to check the balance, just to reassure myself. I did the math in my head first. If everything was on track, the account should have been around 208. $208,000. That's after their shares were set aside and after the house money and after the payback. 208. I log in. I see the number, and my stomach turns. 195. 195,000. I blink like it's going to change. It doesn't. I stare at it until my eyes start burning, because I don't just see a number. I see a gap. A missing $13,000. And I already know what that gap is going to become. It's going to become a weapon in Joe's hands. My phone buzzes while I'm still staring at the screen. A message from Joe. 2 words. Call me. I called Joe back immediately. He picked up on the second ring like he'd been waiting with the phone in his hand. No hey, no how you been. Just, we need to talk about the account. My chest tightened. I said, okay, what's up? And he hit me with it, flat and confident. You took money out. Not a question, a verdict. I kept my voice steady. I borrowed 30. I've been paying it back. Dad knows. The silence on the line lasted half a second. Then he said, so you admit it. That's how fast he did it. I say borrowed. He hears confessed. I tried to slow it down. I explained the plan. I explained the deadline. I explained that the goal was to have everything clean before he turned 21. And Joe goes, well, it isn't clean. It's short. I said, I know. 13. I'm covering it. He laughed. Once. Just a little. Not funny laugh. Condescending laugh. Then he said, it's not 13. And my stomach dropped again. He said, it's 13 plus interest. $3,000. 16 total. 16. Like he was a bank. I said, we never agreed to interest. He said, we're agreeing now. That's when I heard Mac in the background. Not speaking, just present, like muscle. Joe kept going. You're paying it back in 6 months. I actually paused. 6 months? Joe, no. The agreement was 2 years. Dad said... Joe cut me off. Dad doesn't decide. We do. Then he said, we wrote something up, and he emailed it while we were still on the phone. A contract. I opened it on my laptop. It looked official at first glance, but it had that smell again, that overconfident homemade legal vibe. And there it was. 6 months. Not 2 years. 6. I said, I'm not signing that. Joe's voice got colder. If you don't sign, we'll take you to court. There it was. The threat. Clean, casual, like ordering food. I should have yelled. I didn't, because I could feel what Joe was doing. He wasn't trying to solve the problem. He was trying to put me in a corner. So I said, okay, don't sign me. Send it to a lawyer. Joe went quiet like I'd offended him. Then he said, we already talked to someone. And I knew that was a lie, because if a real attorney had looked at this, they would have told him the same thing I was thinking. You can't bully your way into rights you don't have. But Joe didn't want reality. He wanted pressure. And pressure is easier when you make someone feel ashamed. So Joe started talking about what the family will think. He started talking about trust. He started talking about how could you do this to us? And I realized he wasn't just mad about money. He was building a story where I was the villain and he was the victim. I said, Joe, you have your 100,000. You got it. You got it because I gave it. He snapped back. You gave it because it was ours. That line was the whole problem. The entitlement. The ownership. Like my grandparents' money was an all-you-can-eat buffet. I told him, I'll pay the 13. I'll pay it back on the original timeline. 2 years. Joe said, 6 months. I said, 2 years. And then he got nasty. He started listing threats like bullets, court, damages, emotional distress. I didn't even know how to respond to that without laughing, so I didn't. I ended the call. And I did what Joe didn't expect. I stopped negotiating. Because here's the part Joe didn't understand. He wasn't asking for repayment anymore. He was asking for control. And if I signed that contract, I'd be admitting something I didn't do. Not the borrowing, that was real. The theft, the betrayal, the "you can treat me like a criminal" part. So I didn't sign. I sent one message, one sentence. I'll repay the remaining balance. I'm not signing your contract. Then I muted the thread. That should have been the end. It wasn't. Because the next day I started getting messages from people I barely talked to. Cousins, aunties, random family friends. Hey, what's going on? Heard there's drama. Just make it right. That's how I knew Joe and Mac had started shopping the story. They weren't coming to me as brothers. They were going around me, like I was already guilty. 2 days later, Joe sent the email again. Longer this time, more formal. He CC'd Mac again, and he added lines about suing for the 16, plus the remaining funds, plus damages. He wrote it like he was trying to scare me into obedience, and it almost worked. Not because I believed him, but because for a second I pictured myself standing in court, trying to explain my family like it was a spreadsheet. And then I felt the anger rise. Not loud anger, clean anger. The kind that makes you stop begging to be understood. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open. I pulled up the account. I pulled up the transfers. I pulled up every note I had. And I decided, no more improvising. No more family logic. If Joe wanted paperwork, I was going to speak in paperwork. Then my phone buzzed. Not Joe, not Mac, an unknown number. The message was short. I think we're brothers. Can you talk? I stared at it, because in that moment, my first thought wasn't, who is this? My first thought was, oh, this is what my dad was really afraid of. I stared at that text for a long time. I think we're brothers. Can you talk? No name I recognized, no context, just that one sentence, calm, almost polite, like he already knew my life was on fire. I didn't answer right away, because when your family is already accusing you of stealing, the last thing you do is trust a stranger who claims blood. But something in my gut told me this wasn't a scam. This felt personal. So I replied with one line. Who is this? A minute later, he sent back, my name is Chris. I'm your half-brother. Same dad, different mom. I can prove it. Then he dropped 2 photos, old photos, not blurry internet junk. One was my dad, young, smiling, arm around a woman I'd never seen. The other was a kid, maybe 16, standing beside them. Chris. My throat went dry. Because it didn't look staged. It looked like something that had been hidden. I asked him, why are you contacting me now? He said, because I heard what Joe and Mac are doing, and I'm tired of them acting like they own everything. That line hit hard, because I'd been thinking the same thing, but I couldn't say it without sounding bitter. Chris kept it simple. He said he'd known about us for a long time, not in a Facebook stalking way, in a I've been watching from the shadows because your dad made it that way kind of way. Then he said, I'm not calling to take your money. And I almost laughed, because at this point, everyone called me with a price tag. So I told him straight, they're threatening to sue me. Chris said, I know, that's why I'm texting you. Then he sent the message that made my hands go cold on the phone. There's another fund, Not yours, not theirs, mine. He said it was 150,000. 150. And he said it like it was a fact, not a flex. Then he added, "It came with a letter from your grandparents." I felt my heartbeat spike, because my grandparents were the center of everything. They were the reason I had stability. They were the reason Joe and Mac had money. So if my grandparents wrote a letter to Chris, that meant they knew. They planned. They prepared for something my dad never told us. Chris said they set it up because they knew about me. They called it a fund for the illegitimate kids. That word, illegitimate, hit like a slap. Not because it offended me on his behalf, but because it confirmed something ugly. My dad didn't just have one secret. He had a system of secrets. I asked Chris the question I should have asked my dad years ago. How many of us are there? Chris didn't hesitate. He said, "At least 4. Me, Joe, Mac, Chris." And then he added the last one. "There's another half-sister. She's 18. 18. That means she wasn't some before-we-met mistake. That means she was born after my dad had already built the family image, after he'd played husband, father, provider." My stomach dropped so hard it felt like nausea, because I could already see where this was going. If my stepmom didn't know, this wasn't going to be a private family argument. This was going to be a demolition. Chris said, "I'm telling you because Joe and Mac are dragging the family through the dirt, and they're about to step on a landmine." Joe asked, "Do they know about you?" He said, "They do now. I made sure they did." I sat there in my kitchen, staring at the photos, staring at Chris's messages, listening to the refrigerator hum like it was the only normal thing left in my life. And the question in my head wasn't even, is Chris real? The question was, what does this do to my situation? Because Joe and Mac were already using the word theft like a weapon. If Chris existed and there was a separate fund, Joe was going to smell it like blood in the water. Chris must have known what I was thinking, because he texted, "Don't worry, they can't touch it. I already checked." Checked with who? He said, "An attorney. An actual estate attorney. Not a guy who watches TikToks and writes contracts. A professional." And he told me the key detail. Your fund and my fund are separate. Different rules, different names, legally locked. If Joe and Mac tried to grab mine, they'd get slapped down. And if I tried to grab theirs, same. It was compartmentalized on purpose. My grandparents weren't just generous, they were strategic. They knew exactly what kind of people could show up after they died. So they built boundaries in ink. The next morning I called my attorney. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted a firewall. I laid it out clean. I borrowed 30 for a house with my father's encouragement. I've repaid most of it. 13 remains. Joe and Mac are demanding 16 and 6 months and threatening court. Then I told him about Chris, about the separate fund, about the 18-year-old half-sister. There was a pause. Not the kind where someone is shocked, the kind where someone is choosing their words carefully. Then my attorney said something I didn't expect. "Do not discuss this with your father until we have everything documented." And that sentence told me everything. This wasn't just messy. This was dangerous. Not physically, legally, emotionally. Because once you say the wrong thing to the wrong person, they rewrite the story and you spend years trying to correct it. So my attorney drafted a letter, not a threat, a boundary. It said, "Stop contacting my client. Stop making defamatory claims. You have received substantial funds. Any further attempt to claim money you're not assigned will be treated accordingly." And the coldest part, the part I didn't even have to ask for, was the line that implied, you may have no standing, meaning you can threaten court all you want, but you might not even belong at the table. I sent the letter. I didn't explain it. I didn't argue. I just sent it and went quiet. That night, my phone lit up like a Christmas tree. Joe calling, Mac texting, random family members checking in. And I didn't answer. Because for the first time since the email, I wasn't reacting. I was watching. And then I got a message from Chris. One line. He's going to ask me for money. I stared at it. Who? I typed. Chris replied, your dad. Chris was right. The next day he forwarded me a screenshot. A text from my dad. Not, how are you? Not, I'm sorry you're dealing with this. Just straight to business. Hey, we should talk about that fund. The family could really use the help. The family. That phrase should have been warm. In my dad's mouth, it sounded like a tool. Chris replied once, one message. No. No explanation, no apology, just no. And my dad did what he always does when he doesn't get what he wants. He pivoted. He went back to the people he could pressure, Joe and Mac. And suddenly the noise got louder. Joe's tone shifted from confident to furious. He started calling me selfish. He started saying I was hiding money. He started implying there was more, which was the stupidest part, because if there was more, it wasn't mine. It was the thing he couldn't touch, and he knew it. So he did the only thing bullies do when they can't win in court. They try to win in public. Joe posted about it. Not with names, but with enough clues. He made it sound like I stole from my poor brothers, and now I'm refusing to do the right thing. And people ate it up. Because strangers love a villain they don't have to meet. Mac, who usually stayed quiet, finally snapped. Not at me, at Joe. Because Joe had already taken his 100,000. And now Joe was holding on to the 50 grand he'd gotten early, refusing to share it with Mac. That's what greed does. It starts as, we deserve more, and it ends as, I deserve it more than you. Mac started texting me like his hands were shaking. Joe's not giving me my share. He's keeping it. This is messed up. And for a second, I almost felt bad for him. Then I remembered Mac was on that email. Mac was in that threat. He didn't speak up when Joe tried to crush me. He just stood behind Joe and let Joe do the dirty work. So I replied with the only truth that mattered. You chose this. Deal with it. And then the real explosion happened. Not online, at home. Because Chris wasn't the only secret. The 18-year-old girl was real, and my stepmom didn't know about her. She didn't know about Chris either. She didn't know that while she was building a family with my dad, he was building another family in the shadows. I don't know exactly how she found out. Maybe someone messaged her. Maybe Joe's posts pushed someone to talk. Maybe my dad tried to manage it and failed. But I know the result. Because I got a call from my dad late at night. His voice sounded small, not angry, not powerful, just exposed. He said, "She kicked me out." I didn't answer right away, because I could hear the hotel in the background, the muffled TV, the dead air. He said, "I'm at a hotel. She won't let me come home." Then he tried to make it my fault. He said, "If you'd just handled this quietly." And that's when something in me snapped clean. Not rage, clarity. I said, "Quietly? You mean like you handled Chris quietly? Like you handled your daughter quietly?" Silence. He didn't deny it. He couldn't, because denial doesn't work when the receipts exist. He tried one last angle. He said, "I was trying to protect everyone." Protect. Another warm word that sounded like a weapon in his mouth. I said, "No, you were protecting yourself." Then I hung up. After that, it all collapsed fast. Joe backed off the lawsuit talk once my attorney's letter landed. Because bullies love threats until someone threatens back with paper. Mac kept begging for his money. Joe kept stalling. Chris stayed out of it completely, like a man who'd waited his whole life to say no and finally got to. And me? I paid back the 13 grand, not because Joe deserved it, because I did. I paid it back on my timeline, with documentation, clean and boring. Because that's the part nobody teaches you. The best revenge isn't loud. It's when your life stays standing, and their chaos eats them alive. I didn't win a lawsuit. I didn't watch anyone get arrested. I just watched greedy people destroy their own leverage. Joe lost his moral high ground the second he tried to squeeze blood out of family. My dad lost his image. My stepmom lost her illusion. And I lost something too, the idea that blood means loyalty. But I gained something better: boundaries, receipts, and the ability to say one word that changes everything: no.